bully beat up Elvis at school. Years later, Elvis hired him. What happened next broke both their hearts. September 1954. Humes High School in Memphis, Tennessee. Elvis Presley was a senior, 17 years old, skinny as a rail, poor in ways that everyone could see, wearing clothes that made him stand out for all the wrong reasons, in a working-class school, where fitting in meant survival, and standing out meant becoming a target. Pink shirts that no other boy would dare wear. Pegged pants that looked like something from a different era, or a different culture. Hair slicked back with so much grease and pomade. It looked perpetually wet, styled in a way that suggested he thought he was James Dean, or some kind of movie star, instead of a truck driver's son from Tupelo, Mississippi, who'd moved to Memphis public housing. The kind of theatrical, attention-seeking appearance that attracted mockery and violence, in a Memphis high school, where boys were supposed to look tough and masculine, and conventional, not different and artistic, and deliberately provocative. Red West was also a senior at Humes. Red was everything Elvis wasn't: athletic, in ways that suggested natural physical talent, combined with dedicated training, popular with both students and teachers, part of the football team, where he'd earned respect through hard hits and consistent performance, physically intimidating in ways that made other students give him automatic space in crowded hallways. Red was the kind of guy who could walk through the school, and people would instinctively move aside, not out of fear necessarily, but out of recognition that Red occupied space differently than normal students, that he had power and presence that came from physical strength and social status, had a reputation for not taking disrespect from anyone, for settling disputes with his fists when words failed, or when someone crossed lines he'd established, for being someone you didn't mess with unless you wanted serious problems, that could extend beyond school into the neighborhoods where both students and their families lived. And Red thought Elvis was weird, thought the way Elvis dressed was asking for trouble, thought the long hair and flashy clothes suggested Elvis was trying to be something he wasn't. So Red gave Elvis a hard time. Nothing violent initially. Just verbal harassment, mocking comments, jokes about the pink shirts. The kind of bullying that happened every day in 1950s high schools, especially to kids who didn't fit standard masculinity. Elvis took it. Didn't fight back. Couldn't fight back. Red was bigger, stronger, more experienced. Elvis just tried to avoid Red when possible. Tried to ignore the comments. Tried to get through senior year without getting hurt by guys like Red West who saw him as an easy target. Then one afternoon in October 1954, something happened that changed everything. Changed the relationship between Elvis and Red. Changed both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. Elvis was in the bathroom between classes, a representative location. The bathroom at Humes High was one of those institutional spaces with cracked tile floors and graffiti-covered walls and broken stall doors and fluorescent lights that flickered and made everything look harsh and ugly. One of those spaces where vulnerable students were most at risk because teachers rarely monitored it and couldn't hear what happened inside, and social hierarchies got brutally enforced through violence that went unseen and unreported and unpunished. 3 other students were there. Not Red West. Different guys. Bigger guys. Guys who'd been watching Elvis for weeks, building resentment about his appearance and his attitude. Guys who'd decided Elvis needed to be taught a lesson about dressing like a girl, about thinking he was special or important, about not understanding his place in the social order that governed Humes High School, where conformity was enforced through peer violence, and standing out meant making yourself a target for collective punishment. They cornered Elvis. Started with verbal threats. Escalated to pushing, then to punches. Elvis tried to defend himself but was outnumbered, took hits to the face and body, got driven against the wall, was getting seriously hurt when Red West walked in. Look at what Red saw in that moment. 3 guys beating up one guy without mercy. Elvis on the ground covering his face, while 3 students kicked and punched him repeatedly. The kind of violent scene that happened in schools, but usually went uninterrupted, because intervening meant making yourself a target. Red could have walked away. Could have pretended he didn't see it. Could have let those 3 guys finish what they'd started, and let Elvis deal with the consequences of being different in a place that punished difference. Red didn't walk away. Red intervened, told those 3 guys to stop. When they didn't stop immediately, Red made them stop, used his physical presence and his reputation, and his willingness to fight to make those 3 guys back off. Pulled Elvis up from the ground, told the attackers to leave, stayed until they were gone. Elvis was bleeding, face swollen where he'd been hit, ribs hurting where he'd been kicked, breathing hard from fear and adrenaline. Looked at Red West, the guy who'd been giving him a hard time all semester, who'd mocked his appearance, who'd made his life harder, and didn't understand why Red had helped him. Red's explanation was simple. "I don't like the way you dress. Think you look ridiculous. But 3-on-1? That's not right. That's cowardly. You want to fight someone. Fight them fair. What they were doing wasn't fair." Notice what Red revealed about himself in that moment. He had principles, had a code. Bullying one-on-one based on appearance or behavior was one thing. Red considered that acceptable social policing, enforcing norms, teaching lessons. But 3 guys ganging up on one guy who couldn't defend himself, that violated Red's sense of how conflict should work. That was cowardice, not strength. Elvis thanked Red, said he appreciated the help. Red shrugged it off, said it wasn't personal, said Elvis should maybe think about dressing more normal to avoid future problems, then left. Wait, you need to understand what happened in the weeks and months after that bathroom incident. Red and Elvis didn't become friends immediately, didn't have some instant bonding moment where the bully and the victim became brothers, but something shifted. Red stopped actively harassing Elvis, stopped making comments about the clothes and the hair, started giving Elvis a kind of protective space in the hallways. Other students who might have targeted Elvis saw that Red had intervened once, and assumed that meant Red had some kind of claim or protection over Elvis, which made them less likely to start trouble. Elvis graduated from Humes in June 1953, started working at Crown Electric as a truck driver, started recording at Sun Records, started developing the sound and the style that would make him famous. Red graduated and went to Jones County Junior College in Mississippi on a football scholarship. Their paths diverged. They weren't in contact. Red probably assumed he'd never see Elvis Presley again. Then in 1954 and 1955, Elvis's career exploded. That's All Right became a regional hit. Elvis started performing across the South, started appearing on radio and early television, started generating the kind of attention and controversy that turned a Memphis truck driver into a national phenomenon. And as Elvis's fame grew, so did the need for security. The need for people who could protect him from crowds that were getting more aggressive, from fans who were getting more intense, from critics and religious protesters who were getting more threatening. Elvis remembered Red West, remembered the guy from Humes High School who'd intervened when 3 guys were beating him up, remembered that Red was tough, was loyal in his own way, had principles about fairness, even if those principles were rough around the edges. So Elvis tracked Red down, called him, offered him a job. "I need someone I can trust," Elvis said on that phone call. "Someone who can handle themselves. Someone who'll have my back when things get crazy. You did that once in the bathroom at Humes. I'm hoping you'll do it again. But this time I can pay you." Red accepted, dropped out of college, became one of Elvis's bodyguards, and eventually one of the core members of what would be called the Memphis Mafia, the group of friends, employees, and associates who surrounded Elvis for the next 2 decades. Red's job was to protect Elvis physically, to screen fans, to deal with threats, to make sure no one got too close without permission, to use the same toughness that had made him a bully at Humes High School to protect the guy he'd once harassed. Look at the irony. The guy who'd mocked Elvis for being different was now employed because Elvis was different, because that difference created fame, because fame created danger, because danger required protection. Red went from being a threat to Elvis to being Elvis's defense against other threats, from bully to bodyguard, from antagonist to ally. And for 20 years, from roughly 1955 to 1976, that arrangement worked. Red became more than Elvis's bodyguard, became a trusted friend, someone Elvis relied on not just for physical protection, but for emotional support, someone who was there during the good times and the hard times, during the movie years in Hollywood, during the marriage to Priscilla, during the touring years in the 1970s, when Elvis's health was declining and the performances were becoming more difficult. Red was loyal, defended Elvis against critics, dealt with difficult situations, handled conflicts with promoters and venue managers, broke up fights, kept aggressive fans at a safe distance, did all the things Elvis needed someone to do as fame made normal life impossible. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because Red was also witnessing Elvis's decline, was seeing firsthand the prescription drug use that was affecting Elvis's health and his behavior, was watching Elvis gain weight and lose energy and struggle to perform in ways that suggested serious medical problems, was hearing doctors and friends express concerns, was becoming increasingly worried that Elvis was heading toward disaster, and nobody in Elvis's circle was willing or able to stop it. Remember that by the mid-1970s, Elvis was performing hundreds of shows per year, despite being physically unable to sustain that schedule, was taking a complex cocktail of prescription medications to manage pain, to sleep, to wake up, to perform, to deal with anxiety and depression, was gaining weight rapidly, was sometimes barely coherent on stage, was exhibiting behavior that suggested he needed serious medical intervention and significant time off to recover. Red watched all of this, tried to talk to Elvis about it, tried to express concern, but Elvis didn't want to hear it, didn't want to be told he had problems, didn't want to admit that the machinery of his career was destroying him. And Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, didn't want anyone talking about Elvis's health issues because it threatened the touring revenue that was generating millions of dollars per year. In July 1976, Colonel Parker made a decision that would destroy relationships and trigger consequences nobody could have fully predicted. He fired Red West, also fired Red's cousin Sonny West, and another longtime bodyguard named Dave Hebler. The official explanation was about cost-cutting, about streamlining operations, about Elvis needing to reduce expenses during a period when touring revenue was strong but personal spending was out of control. But the real reason, the reason Red and others believed with conviction based on years of watching how Colonel Parker operated, was that these three men knew too much about Elvis's deteriorating condition, had witnessed too many incidents of drug use and erratic behavior, had seen Elvis at his worst too many times, could potentially become massive liabilities if they talked to press or to law enforcement authorities about what was really happening behind the carefully maintained public facade of Elvis's career and personal life. Elvis didn't stop the firings, didn't protect the men who'd protected him for 20 years. Whether he couldn't protect them because Colonel Parker controlled the financial and business operations, or whether he chose not to protect them because they'd been expressing concerns he didn't want to address, is still debated, but the result was the same. Red West was suddenly unemployed, suddenly cut off from the person and the career he'd devoted 2 decades to protecting. Notice how that must have felt for Red. He'd gone from bullying Elvis at Humes High School, to saving Elvis from other bullies, to spending 20 years as Elvis's protector and friend, had given up normal career opportunities, had structured his entire adult life around being part of Elvis's world, and now he was fired, dismissed, cast out, with no clear explanation beyond vague corporate language about cost reduction. Red was angry, felt betrayed, felt used, had financial problems being Elvis's bodyguard paid well, but being suddenly unemployed with a family to support created immediate pressure, and Red had information, had witnessed 20 years of Elvis's private life, had seen things that Elvis and Colonel Parker didn't want the public to know, had stories that could be valuable if someone was willing to pay for them. Wait, here's where the story becomes tragic. In late 1976, Red West and Sonny West and Dave Hebler were approached by a writer named Steve Dunleavy, who was working for a tabloid publishing company. Dunleavy offered them money, substantial money that they needed given their sudden unemployment, to tell their stories about Elvis, to reveal what they'd witnessed, to expose the reality behind the public image. Red had a choice. He could refuse, could protect Elvis's privacy, could honor the friendship and loyalty that had defined their relationship for 20 years, or he could accept the money, could tell the stories, could expose Elvis in ways that might hurt him, but would provide financial security for Red's own family. Red chose to accept, chose to participate in writing a book that would be titled Elvis: What Happened, a book that would detail Elvis's prescription drug use, his erratic behavior, his decline, his problems. A book that would be published in August 1977 and would devastate Elvis both personally and professionally. Look at the timeline. The book was being written in late 1976 and early 1977, was scheduled for publication in summer 1977. Elvis knew it was coming, knew that Red and the others were writing it, knew that his former bodyguard, the guy who'd protected him from bathroom bullies at Humes High School and from aggressive fans and critics for 20 years, was about to expose his most private problems to the world. How did that feel? The betrayal, the sense that someone you'd trusted, someone you'd employed, someone you'd considered a friend, was selling your secrets for money. Elvis tried to stop the book. His lawyers contacted the publisher, offered money not to publish it. The publisher refused. The book was too valuable. The stories too explosive, the potential sales too high to walk away from. In July 1977, advance copies of Elvis What Happened started reaching reviewers and media outlets across America. Stories about the book's explosive content began appearing in newspapers from New York to Los Angeles, in magazines from Time to Rolling Stone, generating headlines that turned Elvis's private medical struggles into public entertainment. Elvis's prescription drug use became public knowledge, discussed on television news programs and radio talk shows. His health problems became tabloid headlines screaming from grocery store checkout racks. His decline became entertainment, news analyzed by critics and commentators who'd never met Elvis but felt qualified to diagnose his problems, based on second-hand information from former employees, with obvious financial motivations for exposing secrets. All based on information provided by Red West and the others who'd been fired exactly 1 year earlier, and who'd chosen money and revenge over protecting the privacy of someone they'd once called a friend and brother. Elvis was devastated. Called Red. Had a conversation we can only reconstruct from later accounts. Reportedly asked Red why. Why would you do this? Why would you betray me? After everything we've been through? After I gave you a life? After you protected me and I protected you? Red's explanation, as later reported, was that he'd done it to help Elvis. That exposing the truth about Elvis's condition might force Elvis to get help, might make Elvis confront his problems, might save Elvis's life by making the situation too public to ignore. But that explanation felt hollow, felt like justification for a decision driven more by financial need and personal anger than by genuine concern for Elvis's well-being. Remember that Elvis What Happened was published on August 1, 1977. Elvis died on August 16, 1977. 15 days after the book was published. 16 days after the book went on sale in bookstores across America. Elvis spent the last 2 weeks of his life dealing with the public exposure of his most private struggles, exposed by someone he'd once called a friend. The book sold well, became a bestseller, made Red and the others money. But that success came at a cost that Red would spend the rest of his life processing. Because after Elvis died, the book stopped being an exposé of a living celebrity's problems and became something darker. A document of a dying man's suffering, published by people who'd been close enough to see that suffering but not close enough, apparently, to protect him from exposure. Red attended Elvis's funeral, stood in the crowd at Graceland, watched Elvis's casket, carried guilt that would stay with him for decades, spent the rest of his life. Red died in 2017 at age 81, trying to process the complexity of his relationship with Elvis, trying to explain why he'd written the book, trying to justify or understand or come to terms with the fact that he'd exposed the person he'd once protected. Look at the full arc of Red and Elvis's relationship. Started with bullying in 1954, transformed through an act of protection in a school bathroom, evolved into 20 years of friendship and employment, ended with betrayal and death and guilt. That's the trajectory. That's the story of how a bully became a bodyguard, became a betrayer, how protection turned into exposure, how loyalty became complicated by money and anger, and fame's corrupting influence. Wait, here's what makes this story particularly painful. Red West genuinely cared about Elvis. That's not in question. The bathroom intervention at Hume's wasn't calculated. The 20 years of bodyguard work wasn't just employment. Red was emotionally invested in Elvis's life and success. But that care wasn't enough to prevent the betrayal at the end. Wasn't enough to stop Red from choosing money and revenge over protecting Elvis's privacy. That's the lesson about relationships and fame, and how loyalty works. It's easy to be loyal when things are good. Easy to protect someone when protecting them serves your interests. Harder to maintain that loyalty when you're fired, when you're angry, when someone offers you money to tell secrets, when your own financial survival depends on making choices that hurt the person you once protected. Elvis made a choice in 1954 to hire Red West, despite their history, to give a former bully a chance at redemption, to trust that the guy who'd once mocked him could become someone who protected him. That was generous. That was forgiving. That showed something admirable about Elvis's character, his willingness to look past past harm and see potential for future loyalty. But Elvis also made choices that led to Red's firing in 1976, allowed Colonel Parker to dismiss the men who'd been trying to warn him about his health, didn't protect the people who'd protected him, created conditions where Red felt betrayed and angry enough to accept money to expose Elvis's private struggles. Elvis's generosity in hiring Red was undermined by his failure to protect Red at the end. That's the complexity. Neither person was purely victim or purely villain. Both made choices that hurt the other. Both betrayed trust in different ways. Elvis's story with Red West is a story about how relationships can survive transformation from antagonism to friendship, but can't always survive the pressures of fame and money and pride and anger. Here's what Red said in later interviews about the book and about Elvis. Said he regretted the timing. Said if he'd known Elvis would die so soon after publication, he might have made different choices. Said he'd hoped the book would force Elvis to get help, would save Elvis rather than hurt him. Said he'd loved Elvis despite everything. Said the relationship was complicated in ways that outsiders couldn't fully understand. But regret doesn't undo harm. Good intentions don't change outcomes. Red wrote the book. The book exposed Elvis. Elvis died 2 weeks later. Those facts exist regardless of Red's later explanations or justifications. The betrayal happened. The damage was done. The story ended with tragedy that could have been avoided if either person had made different choices at key moments. Look at what this story teaches about fame and loyalty, and how relationships survive or fail under pressure. Elvis offered Red redemption, took a bully, and gave him purpose. Red accepted that redemption and served loyally for 20 years. But when Red was fired, when he felt betrayed, when money was offered, that loyalty broke. The redemption Elvis had offered wasn't enough to survive Red's anger and financial need. That's the reality of human relationships. They're conditional. They survive as long as both parties feel their needs are being met. When one party feels betrayed or abandoned, the relationship changes. Loyalty becomes negotiable. Secrets become commodities. Protection becomes exposure. Red and Elvis's story is that reality playing out over 23 years, from 1954 to 1977, from Hume's high school bathroom to Graceland funeral, from bullying to protection to betrayal, from teenage students to men in their 40s, dealing with fame's consequences, from simplicity to complexity to tragedy. That's what happened when Elvis hired his school bully as a bodyguard. 20 years of loyalty followed by betrayal that coincided with death. A friendship that survived transformation from antagonism, but couldn't survive the pressures of fame and firing and financial desperation. A story that started with hope, with Elvis offering redemption and Red accepting it, and ended with Red standing at Elvis's funeral carrying guilt about the book he'd written and the secrets he'd exposed. Not every story of forgiveness ends well. Not every redemption arc stays redeemed. Sometimes the bully you save becomes the friend you trust, becomes the betrayer who exposes you. That's Red and Elvis. That's the cost of fame. That's what happens when loyalty becomes conditional on employment and money and anger override history and care. Red West lived another 40 years after Elvis died. 40 years of processing that relationship. 40 years of defending the book, justifying the choice, trying to explain or understand or come to terms with the fact that he'd been both Elvis's protector and Elvis's exposer. 40 years of being known primarily as the bodyguard, who wrote the tell-all book 2 weeks before Elvis died. That's Red's legacy. Not the bathroom intervention at Hume's, not the 20 years of loyal service, but the book, the betrayal, the timing, the fact that he was the friend who exposed Elvis when Elvis was most vulnerable. That's what people remember. That's what defines Red's place in Elvis's story. And that's the lesson. One act of betrayal can overshadow decades of loyalty. One choice made in anger or desperation can define how you're remembered. Red saved Elvis from bullies in 1954, protected him for 20 years, but wrote a book in 1977 that hurt Elvis in ways that physical threats never could. And that final act, that betrayal, is what Red's relationship with Elvis is known for. Not the protection, not the loyalty, but the exposure, the timing, the tragedy of a friendship that ended so badly despite starting with such promise.